recording the date 14 October 2008. The time 15:31 hours Polish time. The place is the area of the former Sobibor extermination camp. At this camp, according to information from the local museum, which you find all over the place, the Nazis killed about 250,000 Jews and 1,000 Poles in the years 1942 and 1943. They killed them in a part of the camp known as Camp 3, the extermination area, where I am now moving to. The extermination area has a monument which is called the Ash Mountain, which I will film. And in the extermination area there are 7 mass graves found by archaeologist Professor Andrzej Kola in 2001 during an archaeological investigation on site. I will try to film what can be seen of these mass graves. On the ground, what you can see from the air is shown on this photograph. It's taken by a geophysicist by the name of Mr. Paul Baumann. It was made available to me by the director of the Sobibor archaeological project, Mr. Yoram Haimi of Ben Negev University in Israel. You also see the shapes of the graves, not all of them, but 4 out of the 7 graves, which I have numbered here. On this enlarged excerpt from an enlarged section from a Google Earth satellite photograph. I will now move to the extermination area of Sobibor. First of all, one thing that should be pointed out: the consistency of the soil at Sobibor. What is the soil of Sobibor made of? It's this kind of mixture of, I'm not a geologist, of what I would call loam or sandy loam. It has this bright white on top, and below it has a sort of brown coloration. Here we see one of the tables at the entrance of the so-called Remembrance Lane. The Remembrance Lane contains stones with names of people who were killed at Sobibor written on them, stones that were dedicated to these people by relatives, descendants. The claim on the board we have just looked at is that 250,000 Jews were killed at Sobibor. I would like to point out that this number is an estimate. Here we have a look at the whole memory lane. It's an extrapolation from partial data made by a Polish examining judge. This is Zdzisław Łukaszkiewicz. Please forgive the errors in pronunciation. It is not the number of deportees to Sobibor that can be ascertained on hand of documentary evidence. That number is lower. It was established during the trial of Kurt Bolender and others in 1966 before the Landgericht, the county court in Hagen, Germany, on hand of documentary evidence by court expert historian Dr. Wolfgang Scheffler. Dr. Scheffler examined all documents regarding deportations to Sobibor and reached a conclusion that about 150,000 deportees delivered at Sobibor could be established on hand of the documentary evidence. As we continue along the remembrance lane. The estimates, I mean, the work of Dr. Scheffler, it's really an estimate based on documentary evidence and mostly supported by documentary evidence, is remarkably accurate, as shown by a recently discovered document, the so-called Höfel Memorandum, which shows about the same number of deportees until 31/12/1942 as was established by Scheffler, about 101,000 and something. So these are the numbers that can be considered ascertained by documentary evidence, not about 250,000, but rather about 150,000, even though the Hagen Country Court in 1966 pointed out that the number that Scheffler had established was a minimum number, and that the minimum number that could be ascertained on hand of documentary evidence, and that the actual number might well be much higher. But of course, the court did the cautious thing to do. We know from records that these about 150,000 people were deported to Sobibor. There are no records showing that these people were taken anywhere else. There are no records that these people were taken anywhere else, and there are also no eyewitnesses in this sense. All eyewitnesses to events at Sobibor in 1942-1943, whether it's surviving inmates or Ukrainian guards or members of the SS staff, all certify that this was an extermination camp and describe the killing and the body disposal procedure in sometimes rather great big detail. So the situation we have is that all known evidence, all of it, points to Sobibor having been an extermination camp. There is no evidence suggesting that it was what the so-called revisionists who call themselves revisionists, because although they have nothing, what they do has nothing to do with historical revisionism, it is Nazi propaganda. It is anti-Semitic hate speech, nothing more than that. They claim that Sobibor was a transit camp, but there is nothing to this claim. There is not the slightest evidence that would support this claim. All evidence points to Sobibor having been an extermination camp. We are now approaching the area that during the camp's operation was known as Camp 3, the extermination area. This was where the gas chamber stood. This was where they had mass graves into which they threw the dead bodies during the first phase of the camp's operation. This was where they had grids made of railway tracks, of railway rails, to burn the bodies in the later phases of the camp's operation, when the bodies that had been buried were also taken out of the graves and burnt on iron rails, while the newly killed arrivals were burnt right away. In this area, which we are looking now at, this area was subject to an archaeological investigation in 2001 by Professor Andrzej Kola. It is the same area, incidentally, that can be seen on the air and satellite photographs that I showed. In the center of this area there is the so-called Ash Mountain monument. It is a heap that is reportedly made of soil containing ashes and bone fragments from the victims of Sobibor extermination camp. In this area, places I will try to identify as best as ground perspective allows, without core drilling, without digging, which I cannot do, of course. In this area, Professor Andrzej Kola found 7 rather huge mass graves, of which 4 can be seen on air and satellite photographs. They can be seen because the vegetation there in these areas is, for some reason, obviously related to these areas being mass graves, much more dense, much more green. However, and this is, let's say, the main reason why I came here today, it is not only underneath the ground in the mass graves, and not only in the Ash Mountain monument, that human remains can be found. Some bone fragments, this has been shown on photographs I have seen, and this has been reported on the Wikipedia page about Sobibor, are still littering the ground above, around the mass grave areas. I will now try to show some of these bone fragments. I found them when I was here this morning. Let's see if they are still there. Here we see a kind of hole that someone has dug for whatever reason. I don't know if it was a person or an animal. I assume it was a person. There is soil, probably from this hole. And in this soil we see what I already showed this morning. We see these white shards. And these white shards, I will pick up again the biggest of them. The only explanation for what this is that I can find is that this is a bone fragment. I forgot a warning. I'm not supposed to do this, picking up bones according to Jewish religious laws. So I'm probably hurting people's religious feelings, the religious feelings of certain people. But I think with liars and propagandists saying that there was no mass murder at Sobibor, we should show in all clarity what can be found on this site. Besides the documentary evidence, besides the eyewitness evidence, besides the archaeological reports, some people think, and some people claim, that only what you can see and touch is real. Here you can see and touch one bone fragment, one of the relatively few bone fragments that I found above ground. And as all reason or logic tells us, given the evidence, one out of many, many, many bone fragments that are somewhere in this area. Mostly, of course, buried underground and never brought to the surface except by rubbery diggers due to these, I presume, well, due to a number of factors, including but not limited to these Jewish religious laws. Also take into account that this is, as I've been told by Joram Jaime, this is Polish holy ground, and therefore obtaining an authorization to excavate here is rather difficult. Once again, the texture, this is the noise we hear. It's not a piece of wood, it's not a stone, it's something with a hardness in between a piece of wood and a stone. And the texture it has, to me, who am not an expert, suggests a bone fragment. I will try to obtain, it probably won't be granted, I will try to talk to the museum director and obtain permission to pick up this bone fragment, take it somewhere and have it analyzed to confirm that it is really a bone fragment. I don't know if the analysis can also establish that it is a human bone fragment, but as I said before in my previous video of this morning, this was not a chicken farm. This was an extermination camp, so any bone fragments that are found here are. Here's a smaller one. Here's another one, also smaller. All bone fragments that can be found here are human bone fragments. This hole may have been, I'm not sure, may have been the work of a rubbery digger. Take another look at this area, this small area, the bone fragments that are here. I haven't yet checked all of the camp area, This is too big to do it in such a short time, and I had to quit this morning because my battery ran out. But I found such bone fragments also in other places in this area, which we shall go to now. What we see here is the road or the path leading up to the so-called Ash Mountain Monument. By the side of where I'm standing, you can see ground that is different from the rest in two respects. It is greener and it is higher, sort of uneven. The place where I'm standing is, if I'm not mistaken, one of the places where Professor Andrzej Kolla located a mass grave, and one of the places also where the mass grave shape outlined by Professor Kolla on a map, on several maps as a matter of fact, can be recognized from the air. I shall now walk along this path. On this Google Earth map of Sobibor from the air, I have put together a number of objects collected along this path, which I think have the structure of bone fragments. How do I know? How do I know they are not simply stones? Well, let's look at this one. Is this the structure of a stone? Or is it the outer part of a bone? What stone looks like this? Or let's see here. This structure which resembles a, what would you call it, a sponge? Sponge. Isn't this bone marrow? As I said, I'm not an expert, but it looks like that to me. And again, I would like to have these samples analyzed and will try to obtain permission to do so. It may not be granted, but I'll ask. This here also makes this screeching sound. And note the difference between the coloration inside and out. I don't know of any stone that looks like this. Or like this. Or like this. Notice that this here is whiter on the outside than on the inside. Or it's whiter on one side than on the other. This may suggest different stages of calcination or burning. I don't know which is the more advanced. It means whether the white one is the more burnt or the black one is the more burnt. But in any case, the black one looks like lava. And this is certainly not a lava area. Again, the spongy texture, which I think suggests bone marrow. Also visible here. And in this here, very clearly, I'll try to show this as best as possible. This looks like a, I don't know what kind of bone this is. Listen, what sound it makes. It's definitely that of a bone. A small one. Note the spongy structure. More sponge.